Okay, so last week when we were doing Pilegesh Begiva, so I discussed the 15th of Av, which is connected to the story of Pilegesh Begiva. But Agav, I take a lot of digressions in the Tanakh Shiurim, so I want to talk a little bit about the fast of Sunday, which is the 17th of Tamuz, even though that taka is not connected to the narrative in the book of Shoftim. The Mishnah in Maseches Tainis, which is the exact same Mishnah that talks about the 15th of Av, mentions that there were 5 tragedies that happened on the 17th of Tammuz, and there are 5 tragedies that happened on the 9th of Av. And because of these 5 tragedies, these days became fast days. Now, the 5 tragedies of the 17th of Tammuz were tragedy number 1, is the day that Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai after 40 days. He saw the golden calf, he saw the egel, and he smashed the luchais, smashed the tablets, smashed the Torah. So that was tragedy number 1. Now, tragedy number 2, I'm not going to fully explain this because I'm going to go back over it, is Batel HaTamid, that at some point in time, we'll have to see what point of time, the Korban Tamid, the daily offering that was brought in the morning and the afternoon, ceased. Tragedy number 3, the city was broken into, meaning there was a siege around Jerusalem. This is referring to the Second Temple, and that siege lasted for 3 years. But on the 17th of Tammuz, the Romans broke through the wall. 3 weeks later, the temple was destroyed, but they broke through the wall. Hufka ha'ir. Tragedy number 4 is a man called Apustamus, we'll have to see who on earth he is, burnt a Sefer Torah. And tragedy number 5 is Etzelem, an idol, was Huamad Behechal, was put up in the Beis HaMikdash. Now, this listing is extraordinarily obscure because 3 out of the 5 we don't know exactly when it happened. Meaning, we know the breaking of the luchais, that happened in the Torah. We know the breaking through the city wall by the Romans, that is historically recorded. We're not sure what Batel HaTamid means, I'll explain each of them, and we're not sure of Apustamus burning the Torah. And we're not sure of when was an idol put up in the temple. Meaning, yeah, you're given the date, the 17th of Tammuz, but when? What period of history did that happen in? So keep in mind, and I'll try to explain it, that 3 out of the 5 tragedies are a little historically indeterminate. Meaning we're not exactly sure when and where we locate them. I will go over the different opinions. Now, the second part of the Mishnah, the 5 tragedies of the 9th of Av, are actually much more clear. We kind of know exactly when they occurred. The first tragedy is again in the Torah. The Meraglim came back on the 8th of Av. They gave their story. And that night, all of the people cried, the night of the 9th of Av. And God decreed that you spent the night of Av crying over nothing, this day shall become a day of eternal crying. That's the Chet HaMeraglim. So Shiva Tamuz is connected to the Chet HaEgel. Tisha B'Av is connected to the Chet HaMeraglim. Tragedy 2 and 3 are also very clear. The first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed on the 9th of Av. And the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed on the 9th of Av, exactly 490 years later. Where did I get the 490? Because there were 70 years of exile until the second temple was built, and the second temple stood for 420 years. So Tisha B'Av, from Tisha B'Av to Tisha B'Av, 490 years. The second Mikdash was destroyed on the same day as the first Mikdash. Right? So tragedy 1 is Meraglim. Tragedy 2 is Bayis Rishon. Tragedy 3 is Bayis Sheni, by the Romans. Tragedy 4, which we talked about a few days ago, was the Bar Kokhba revolt and the destruction of Beitar, which occurred in the year 135 of the Common Era. So Chorban Beis HaMikdash is 70, but Tisha B'Av, 135, was the devastating crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt in this town called Beitar, and that also happened on the 9th of Av. And the fifth tragedy was that after Beitar, one of Hadrian's decrees was that the areas around Jerusalem would be plowed with salt to destroy their fertility, and that was also said to be on some 9th of Av. Was it the same 9th of Av as Beitar, or was it later? That we don't know. But basically, we do have a pretty clear identification of all of the 5 tragedies of Tisha B'Av. The Ched HaMeraglim, the Chorban Bayis Rishon, the Chorban Bayis Sheni, the destruction of Beitar in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 135, 65 years after the destruction of the temple. And then at some point, we don't know if it was that same year or another year, something happened on Tisha B'Av in which Jerusalem was plowed over with salt. So the 5 events, of course, later history has other events, the beginning of World War I and the Spanish expulsion, those are later events, but the Mishnah records these 5 events. So those 5 events are pretty clear. When it comes to the 17th of Tammuz, they're somewhat obscure. And let me mention why that's so. The only event, actually, I mentioned 3 are obscure, actually 4 are a bit obscure. The only event, well, actually all 5 are obscure in different ways, but the only thing that we know very, very clearly when it happened was the breaking of the Luchos. That happened. Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai. He was there for 40 days. He came down on the 40th day. He saw the golden calf. He smashed the Luchos. So that's a pretty clear determinant. Now, the second, well, yeah, maybe I said them out of order. The second one is the city was broken into, meaning there was a siege and the city was broken into, the wall was breached on the 17th of Tammuz. So here there's an important comment in the Gemara in Tainus. The Gemara in Tainus asks the kasha, how can you say that the enemies broke into the city on the 17th of Tammuz? In the book of Yirmiyahu it says that the enemies broke into the city on the 9th of Tammuz. So the Bavli answers, there is taka a difference between the Chorban Bayis Rishon by the hands of the Babylonians, which is what Yirmiyahu is talking about, and the Chorban Bayis Sheni by the Romans, which is what the Mishnah is talking about. Meaning, when the Babylonians broke into Jerusalem and they destroyed the Mikdash on the 9th of Av, that's true, they actually broke into the city on the 9th of Av. I'm sorry, the 9th of Tammuz, and the Chorban was a month later. But the Romans broke into the city on the 17th of Tammuz, and they destroyed the Mikdash 3 weeks later. So the Gemara then asks, Gemara in Tainus, so why don't we fast on the 9th of Tammuz? Why do we commemorate the breaking into the city of the Mikdash Sheni and not the Mikdash Rishon? Right? Why not the Mikdash Rishon? So the Bavli answers that we always go with the latest Sarah. Right? The latest Sarah is most painful to us, so we do the second rather than the first. Why don't you do both? Why don't we have a fast on the 9th of Tammuz because of Hufka Ha'ir, and on the 17th of Tammuz because of Hufka Ha'ir? So on that, the answer is very simple. We don't want to make fast days so close to each other. That would be a hardship. Although L'maisa, we do have one instance. We have Tzom Gedalia after Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Okay, but B'derech Klal, we try to avoid putting fast days too close together. So Hufka Ha'ir, 17th of Tammuz, the Gemara itself tells us, is very, very clearly referring to the Bayis Sheni, that the Romans broke into Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz, and the temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av, 3 weeks later, meaning the Beis HaMikdash remained for another 3 weeks after the Romans had already entered the city. Okay, so that's Hufka Ha'ir. So Luchos is number one. Hufka Ha'ir, we have the Gemara's explanation. By the way, the Talmud Yerushalmi gives another answer. The Talmud Yerushalmi asks the same kasha as the Bavli, that why do you say Hufka Ha'ir is the 17th, Hufka Ha'ir is the 9th? So the Bavli's answer is Mikdash Rishon, Mikdash Sheni. The Talmud Yerushalmi says no. Even the Mikdash Rishon, the Babylonians broke into the city on the 17th of Tammuz. Why does Yirmiyahu say the 9th of Tammuz? So it's an amazing answer. It says that with the devastation of the Churban Beis HaMikdash just a few weeks later, people were so discombobulated that they made mistakes regarding the date. They kind of collapsed the 9th of Av with the 9th of Tammuz, meaning a prophet of Hashem gave the wrong date. There was a kilkel in the Cheshbon. The actual Cheshbon was the 17th, and somehow Yirmiyahu and other people thought it was the 9th, because they compared the 9th of Av and they figured out 9th of Tammuz, etc. Okay, so it's a machlokes the Bavli and the Yerushalmi regarding Hufka Ha'ir. But now we come to the third one. The Korban Tamid was discontinued. Now, the Korban Tamid, of course, is the mitzvah d'oraisa, that every morning and every afternoon, every day of the year, Shabbos, Yom Kippur, in addition to all the other korbanos, you got to bring the Korban Tamid of the morning. That's why it's called Tamid. Tamid is always. And the Korban Tamid of the afternoon. So that became Batel on the 17th of Tammuz. What is that referring to? So there are at least 3 different explanations for that. The Gemara does not really clarify it. Although the Gemara gives a story which may indirectly clarify it. The simple pshat, that when most people learn the Mishnah, this is how it's explained to them, is that the Bitul HaTamid occurred on the same day as the breaking into the city. In other words, the basic idea was, for the Mikdash Sheni, that the Romans burst through the wall of Jerusalem on the 17th of Tammuz, which is 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av. And from the time the Romans entered the city, even though the Beis HaMikdash was standing, conditions were such that they were not always able to bring the Korban Tamid. This is how the Mishnah would normally be explained to most people. In other words, Batul HaTamid, number one, doesn't mean they didn't bring the Tamid at all, but they could no longer depend on a daily supply, and this is Gufa connected to the Romans going through the city. In other words, the Bitul HaTamid, whether it was complete or partial, was the last 3 weeks before the Churban, and it's connected to Hufka Ha'ir. Which would mean, of course, that we actually don't know, was there a Bitul HaTamid in the Bayis Rishon at all? Now, let's say I say like the Bavli, that the Babylonians went into the city on the 9th of Tammuz. Does that mean there was a Bitul HaTamid from the 9th of Tammuz? Or maybe there wasn't a Bitul HaTamid, because Bitul HaTamid is only referring to what happened after the Romans entered the city. So that's pshat number one. And again, for most people, that would be Pashat pshat. But the emes is, if you look in Rashi in Sefer Daniel, which is a place that many people might never encounter, but I hope you will manage to encounter that as well. Rashi actually makes an amazing statement. The Roman siege against Jerusalem was a very long siege. It lasted several years till they broke through the city. If you remember, the Gemara in Gittin that we study on Tisha B'Av talks about the great famine as the Romans cut off supplies and the like. Rashi actually says the Korban Tamid stopped 3 years before the Churban Beis HaMikdash. Now, stopped doesn't have to mean total, but it means it was unpredictable. You could no longer depend on it. So according to Rashi, the Shiva Asar B'Tamuz of Hufka Ha'ir and the Shiva Asar B'Tamuz of Batel HaTamid are actually not connected to each other. The Shiva Asar B'Tamuz of Hufka Ha'ir is 3 weeks before the Churban. The Romans broke through the walls, and they eventually destroyed the Mikdash 3 weeks later. But the Shiva Asar B'Tamuz of Batel HaTamid, according to Rashi, is not referring to a Bitul HaTamid after the Romans broke into the city, but a Bitul HaTamid that was much earlier, from the time of the beginning of the siege. That at some point on the 17th of Tamuz, at the beginning of the siege, 3 years before the Churban, there was no longer a reliable supply of animals that could be used for the Korban Tamid. Now again, that doesn't mean they never brought it, but it was no longer Tamid. So that's a little known fact, because as I say, almost everybody who learns the Mishnah is always assuming that the Bitul HaTamid is a result of the last 3 weeks after the Romans broke in. According to Rashi, it was 3 years earlier than that. Now, there is a third pshat. The Gemara in Tainus itself gives a story, and you wonder exactly, what does this have to do with Bitul HaTamid? Remember that after the Hanukkah story, now remember, the Hanukkah story is well before the Roman conquest. That's when Eretz Yisrael was under the Syrian Greeks, Antiochus. And we had the Great Rebellion, and the Chashmonaim established a dynasty. Right? This is the Malchus of the Chashmonai in the waning decades of the Bayis Sheni before the Romans. And it mentions that, just like in George Orwell's Animal Farm, what happens is the animals become dictators, or some of the animals become dictators, etc. So one of the tragedies of Jewish history is that the Hasmonean kings, the Maccabees, fought against Hellenization for the primacy of the Torah, but the later Hasmonean kings became Hellenists and persecutors of the Chachamim. They became the very enemy they were they defeated. And towards the very end of the Hasmonean era, this is after the Maccabees themselves are dead, there are 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, both of which are Greek names. And they had a civil war. Each one wanted to claim Malchus. And imagine, an army of one brother is besieging. So one brother was in Jerusalem. An army of one brother is besieging the other brother. A state of war. And in fact, that's how the Romans gained a foothold. One of the brothers invited the Romans to send over an army to help them out. Not a good move. Once the Romans came in, they decided they might as well conquer the whole land. Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. This is around the 60s BCE. So this is over 100 years before the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So it mentions a story that when the brothers were besieging, right, one brother was besieging, I always forget which one was inside which, Hyrcanus versus Aristobulus. One was in the city, and one was besieging the city. But they still wanted, both sides still wanted the Korban Tamid to be brought. So it mentions every day some money, some silver coins were lowered in a basket from the wall, and it would be taken, and they would put lambs in the basket to be lifted up. So that way, even in a state of siege, the Korban Tamid was brought. At some point, a certain elder said, you're really working against your own purposes, because as long as the people inside are bringing the korban tamid, they get special divine protection. So the next time they lowered the basket, the other side put in a pig, a squealing pig. And as they're lifting up the basket, it's described very dramatically that the pig started squealing very loud, and it stuck its feet, its claws, or whatever you call it, its hoofs. Right? Pigs have split hoofs, right? That's the example of the hypocrite. They're treif on the inside because they don't. That's why a pig. You know, plenty of animals are not kosher, but there's a certain revulsion towards the pig in Judaism that's much worse than other non-kosher animals. And the Bali Musar like to say, because the pig represents hypocrisy. Because there are two signs for a kosher animal, right? One is split hoofs, and the other is regurgitating its cud and re-swallowing it. So the horse is a treif animal, but the horse is at least an honest animal. I look at the hoofs and I see, not split. The pig is a deceptive animal. Besides being a dirty animal, it's also a deceptive animal, because the hooves are split. On the outside, it looks kosher. It's treif on the inside. So better to be an honest horse, honest donkey, honest dog. Right? In China they eat dogs, right? But dogs are treif. Honest dogs. But the pig, a hypocrite, that we can't stand. So it mentions that look at the Chilul Hashem, in which Jews are sending a pig to be brought to the Beis HaMikdash. Now, this story has nothing to do, historically, with the Churban Beis HaMikdash on the hands of the Romans. This is a story in the waning years of Malchus Hashmonai, which occurred, 130 years before the Churban. This is around the 60s, BCE. So apparently, the Gemara understood that on the 17th of Tamuz is where the pig story happened. And from that time onwards, there was no longer a steady supply of animals for the korban tamid. So again, the chiddush of this is that this is talking about Bitul HaTamid not in connection with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and not in connection with the Roman siege, but this is a Bitul HaTamid that dates from the time of the Chashmonaim, towards the very end. Okay? So we have three different explanations. One is the Tamid was ceased the last 3 weeks after the Romans broke through the city. The other is the Tamid was ceased 3 years when the Romans began their siege. And the third is it's referring to the particular story of the pig. And it's an amazing thing. This story is repeated in the Bavli 3 times. So apparently this was a Maisa the Chachamim wanted to communicate in great, great detail. Okay, so that's the 3 opinions regarding Bitul HaTamid. Now, the next opinion is, or the next tragedy is Apustimus burnt the Torah. A lot of problems. First of all, who on earth is Apustimus? Is his identity of any importance? Number 2, when did he do it? And number 3, this may sound like a callous question, but it is a question. Burning a Sefer Torah is a tragedy. Indeed, if when we become aware of a Torah being burnt, we're supposed to rip our garments. But Lamaisa, unfortunately, it's not a unique tragedy. I mean, how many Torahs did the Nazis burn? In other words, to say that one of the reasons we fast on the 17th of Tammuz is because a Sefer Torah was burned, and that's why a national, at least one of the reasons, a national fast day was proclaimed. It actually is a little schwer. It's actually a little difficult. Would that be such, again, it's tragic, but is that such a singular event that you make a national fast day because of it? So, once again, there are a few explanations for this. One explanation is Look at the Lashon. Apustimus burnt the Torah. This was not a regular Sefer Torah. This was a special Torah. Now, the Sefer Torah that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote, remember on the day of his death, he miraculously wrote 13 Sifrei Torah. He gave one to each tribe, and one was put in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Unfortunately, the Torahs of Moshe were lost. Certainly the one in the Kodesh HaKadoshim was lost because the Aron HaKodesh was hidden before the Churban Bayis Rishon, and we didn't get it back by the Bayis Sheni. So what happened to the tribal Sifrei Torah? I don't know, but apparently they were not around either. Imagine losing Moshe Rabbeinu's Torahs. But there was one Torah that we had that was written by Ezra at the beginning of the Second Temple. And we know that Ezra was the leader of the spiritual leader of the Jewish people at the time of the second. At the beginning of the Bayis Sheni, Ezra was the head of the Anshe Knesset Hagdola, and the Gemara says about Ezra that he would have been great enough to receive the Torah had Moshe Rabbeinu not done it first. So Ezra was like a second Moshe. And he also wrote a Sefer Torah, and that was kept for a lot of the Second Temple period. And at some point, we still don't have a date. Was this towards the Chorban or in the middle? Apustimus, who was a Roman official, in one of his travesties, burnt not just a Sefer Torah, but burnt the Sefer Torah that Ezra wrote. Right? So that's why this is more... Again, burning a Torah is always a tragedy, but this was a little bit more of a tragedy. It was the Sefer Torah of Ezra, and Ezra essentially was kind of a second Moshe Rabbeinu. So it was like losing, again, the Torah of Moshe Rabbeinu. So that's one explanation. But there's a second explanation that's very, very interesting. It may sound a little drush, homiletical, but this was offered by a Hungarian Rav. I don't remember his name. I think it was Rav Weiss, 50 years ago, maybe 55 years ago. And this was a Rav who was a Talmud Chacham, but he was also a bit of, maybe you would call him an amateur historian. He was very well versed in Greek and Roman history. And this actually connects to Bittul HaTamid of the Chashmonaim story. This goes back to the Hyrcanus and Aristobulus conflict. And I had mentioned that the way the Romans got a foothold into Eretz Yisrael was tragically by our own invitation. That the side that was outside of Yerushalayim, trying to besiege the one that was inside, invited the Romans to kind of send mercenaries to help them fight. And the general who answered the call was actually a very famous Roman general. He was Julius Caesar's buddy, comrade in arms. That was Pompey. If you ever learned Roman history, perhaps in an earlier Gilgal, so Pompey, Pompey. That's actually the same city that got destroyed by the volcanoes, but this is a General Pompey. And Pompey, without authorization of the Roman Senate or the emperor, just figured, once I'm in Eretz Yisrael, might as well conquer the whole thing. In fact, that's actually the historical meaning of the famous statement. Because of Sinas Chinam, the Second Temple was destroyed. Now, certainly, spiritually, it means there was a lot of divisiveness. But historically, look how exact it is. Because of the hatred of the brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, that is why the Romans gained a foothold in Eretz Yisrael. And that foothold, eventually, 100 years later, culminated in the Churban Beis HaMikdash. So it's mamish literal. Because of Sinas Chinam, the Second Temple was destroyed. Very specifically, the Sinas Chinam of Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. So the day of Pompey's entry into Eretz Yisrael was the year 63 BCE. Again, that's how many years? 133 years before the Churban, 163 and 70. What's the addition there?
133.
what is it?
133.
133 years before the Churban, right? Now, the very first edict then Pompey proclaimed as self-proclaimed governor of Judea was that from now on, the law of the land shall be Roman law and shall not be Torah law. That was his edict as provincial governor. So this Rav wants to say, it's homiletical. The statement, apostomus, first of all, he identifies apostomus as Pompey. They don't sound that similar, but he claims based on corruption of words, etc., apostomus is Pompey. So what does it mean? Pompey burnt the Torah? So he says, it doesn't say Pompey burnt the Sefer Torah. Pompey burnt the Torah. So midrashically, this could simply mean by abrogating the primacy of divine law, that is tantamount to burning the Torah, because it was no longer the law of the land. You see? So that occurred on the 17th of Tamuz. So the point I'm making is that some of these events do not connect to the Churban Beis HaMikdash, at least directly. They're much earlier. Now the final event is also ambiguous. An idol was erected in the Beis HaMikdash. Here's our real problem. In the Greek, and whether it's Antiochus or whether it's in the Roman period, there actually is no recorded instance of the Romans putting up an idol in the temple. The only instance we have was an attempt to do so. One of the Meshugana emperors of Rome was Caligula. Caligula was a Rasha, but in his partial defense, he was also insane. Ad kedei kach that in Roman history it is recorded, he made his horse his vice emperor, etc. Caligula demanded, as an act of homage, that the Jews put up his statue in the Beis HaMikdash. That is historically recorded. But it is also recorded that even upon pain of death, the Jewish people refused to do it. And they were prepared to fight the Roman armies over this. And somebody convinced Caligula, the provincial governor, convinced Caligula not to pursue the idea at the time. So if that's the case, we don't really have any instance of the Romans ever actually putting up an idol in the Beis HaMikdash. We only have the attempt by Caligula. So some connect this to Antiochus. They say Humad Selim Behechal is a much earlier point, that for the 3 years that the Yevanim controlled the Beis HaMikdash, they did put up idols. So it's referring to Antiochus. And there's even another pshat that it goes back to the time of the Jewish kings, where in the book of Malach, before the Churban of the first temple, where the evil king Manasseh put up idols. So this kind of history lesson just shows you that these events could happen all sorts of different times. Unlike the 9th of Av, where the events follow a very clear historical sequence, here we actually have a lot of uncertainty as to which things belong to which. The last one of Selim Behechal is not the Roman period, because there was no idol actually erected, but it either refers to Antiochus or it refers to Manasseh.
Do we know that this is only referring to one event, or could it be referring to all of them?
Which one?
The idol.
It might be all. It might be all of them. Although then you'd have to assume that each of these events happened on the 17th of Tamuz. Yeah, it is possible. It is possible. Although it uses a lashon yachid. Okay, Rav Weiss, Rav Usher is speaking downstairs, so it'll be very worthwhile to go hear him.
Thank you for listening to this Ohr Somayach production. To find out more and to partner in our mission, please visit ohr.edu.